over the world and training people to make contact with the actual extraterrestrials. And we've had all these beautiful experiences. Nothing has been scary. No one has been harmed. They have just been so unbelievably cosmic consciousness beautiful. And it's so different from what you hear and see if you go to a UFO conference or look at a cable TV show about aliens and UFOs. It's like 180 degrees opposite. And so it's this total disconnect. And I think it's time for us to speak very clearly of what's going on here. And I know that the truth is much stranger than the fiction, and people have their belief systems built up around this, because whether you're new age, old age, what have you, it's really easy to buy into the good alien, bad alien thing, because we are wired that way from our collective experience as humans. But you know what? That's the big challenge of the moment. It's for us to transcend, as it were, the monkey mind, and transcend these fears and go into a higher state of consciousness where we can discern not only the deception, this cosmic deception that is being washed like a tidal wave all over the world, but also look and find within ourselves this state of one consciousness, the unbounded universal mind within us that is shining within all of these civilizations, and discern the truth for ourselves. And when we do, what we're going to find is that any civilization capable of interstellar travel, there's nothing on Earth they need. They don't need to be here to get our sperm and eggs. They don't need to be here to get gold mined, like Zecharia Sitchin suggested in the book, his book, I forget the name of it.
There's been so many.
Help me here, Linda. Anyway.
I don't know. There's been too many of his books.
So, you know, there are all these mythologies that are very xenophobic and buy into a certain mindset that are things that we have to learn to transcend and discern the truth, and then with courage learn how to make contact ourselves. Because, you know, here's the basic, you know, you can sit around and sort of, excuse me for saying this, mentally masturbate all day about this stuff, reading other people's accounts. What I tell people, set all that aside. You can learn how to make contact with these visitors yourself. And when you do, if you have this discernment where you can discern the difference between an ARV and a PLF and a real ET craft and an ET being, and you're in this state of consciousness, it'll be so clear what the difference is. It's like night and day. There's no comparison. You're going to be able to see that these visitors who have been coming here for thousands of years, by the way, they have no malice towards Earth and her people. However, they're very concerned about the hostility humans have, and that as Neil Armstrong, who landed on the moon, my uncle designed the lunar module that took Neil Armstrong to the moon, and my uncle was the senior project engineer for that at Grumman. It was now Northrop Grumman, but that built the lunar module. And when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon the first time, and the first man on the moon, the crater around where we landed was crowded with these extraterrestrial vehicles. I have multiple witnesses to this. And Neil Armstrong told a member of our team that, yes, but we were warned off the moon. Why? Because we were going there as part of the arms race with the Soviet Union. We didn't go to the moon. The Apollo program was a highly militarized, competitive program where we weren't going out to the moon, or our plans to go to Mars were not as sort of a unified, peaceful world civilization. It was part of the military-industrial complex competition and a proxy for the Cold War. And that is the truth about the Apollo program. Everyone knows it. So I think that the ETs have made it very clear, the real ETs, that the entry ticket to being interplanetary ourselves is to begin to be civilized, to live together peacefully, to renounce weapons of mass destruction, to go out into space free of weapon systems and with this consciousness of universal peace. And then the universe is going to open its arms wide open. Until then, they're watching what's going on here very, very carefully. Why? Because within our classified programs, as Ben Rich, who was the head of Lockheed Skunk Works, told us before he passed away. And this is the guy, Kelly Johnson started the Skunk Works for Lockheed. And then, the Skunk Works are what built the U-2 and all these high-tech, but they have all these programs dealing with this super high-tech stuff like the alien reproduction vehicles and anti-gravity craft. And he said to us, well, we already have the means to travel among the stars faster than the speed of light. And I knew that already. But that basically those are locked away in a black box, and it would take an act of God to benefit humanity. To which I said, well, it's time for us to be that act of God, because the human race needs this knowledge, but they need the truth that is the real truth and not this spun, fearsome nonsense. The other issue, of course, is that we're not going to be allowed to travel amongst the stars until we become a peaceful and evolved civilization, because I have been told that there are entire worlds out there that are at our level of technological development that they don't even have a word for war. They don't even have a concept of the kind of war and conflict we've had on this planet. And we would be a threat to them. So I turn this around. When I'm meeting with these military folks in Washington and at the Pentagon, I say, look, I know you guys are trained to view anything as a potential threat, but let's turn this around a little bit. Here we are, a civilization. Now, my grandmother had horse and buggies in the late 1800s, and her and, rifles and whatnot, to thermonuclear weapons and space travel. This would have to be a big red flag coming up over this planet, because our technological development had surpassed our social and spiritual development as a people. I mean, there are individual exceptions, but as a civilization on Earth. And that is the big challenge of now. The big challenge of now is to socially and spiritually develop an understanding of these things and to vow to live together in peace and to go into space in peace. And then the whole cosmos will open for us. But until then, there's a quarantine around this planet, and it's appropriate, because there are planets out there that have to be protected from us. So I tell people, ironically, while everyone's worrying about, running around like Chicken Little with their heads cut off about, the alien threat, I'm going, they're not the threat. We're the threat. Humans are the threat. We're the ones, you can speculate all you want about what the alien agenda, quote unquote, might be, but let's just review the last 100 years of human behavior up until the present moment in Darfur. Genocide, massive warfare, tens of millions of people killed in World War I and II, and never mind the other wars, thousands of hydrogen bombs and thermonuclear weapons that go through space, ICBMs, and then could land all over the world, turning the world into an uninhabitable cinder. And the beginnings of space travel, but in a way that has not been cooperative, and has been a proxy for the military. Now, this is something which, unless you were brain dead and you were, as an extraterrestrial people, you would be rather cautious, and rightly so. So I think we need to, as the old saying goes, take a hard look in the mirror before we start worrying about these other civilizations. I don't think there's a scintilla of evidence that they're hostile. And one thing I want to mention is that if you have the technological ability to travel through interstellar space, do you really think that there's anything on Earth that they would need to acquire? No. Because if you have that ability, you can materialize and dematerialize in various points in space and time. You can, from the elemental level of existence, the zero-point energy field, manifest any material or any substance. You could take one cell of a biological organism and develop it and clone it into a full organism. Even our classified programs already have that ability in genetics and neuroscience. So there's nothing here that they need. This idea that somehow they have to come here to Earth to get this is another mythology. It just doesn't pass the sniff test if you have any scientific understanding of what kinds of sciences would accompany the ability to go faster than the speed of light and travel amongst the stars. So then the question becomes, what is the phenomenon? It's a real phenomenon that people are describing when they describe these weird creatures and these abductions and mutilations and all this stuff. Well, it's not at all what people think. And I think people have to be extremely careful about this and educate themselves on what the covert human capabilities are that extend even into, we're going to get a little stranger here, into the electromagnetic frequencies that are interdimensional, that tap into, shall I say, lower astral entities. Now, these are not extraterrestrial, but some weirdnesses with an extraterrestrial interstellar people. And so what happens is that people throw all this junk together, all these different phenomena, plural, and call it the same thing. And the result is a lot of confusion. But that obfuscation and confusion and chaos in the paradigm has been injected deliberately by people who benefit from chaos and fear. And I think this is why people have to free themselves from that, take a step back, look at the materials we have put out there. You know, I've spent 18 years assembling the most astonishing government documents, insider witness testimony, all the experiences that we have had, and we put it out there at disclosureproject.org. And people need to become educated on that so they don't get fooled again, like the old song, we won't be fooled again. You know, we keep getting fooled. I mean, we were tricked into the weapons of mass destruction thing in Iraq. My concern is that people are so gullible and can so easily be frightened that we'll be tricked again into this interplanetary alien threat scenario, which is a complete hoax, an utter and complete hoax. And who benefits from that? The people who want to consolidate their own central power around a military global junta, or sort of ruling militaristic financial class that has everyone running around scared like we were after 9/11, and who can amass more and more centralized power. So I think people need to wake up to this, and it's time for childhood's end, and it's time for us to realize what the truth is.
Well, I can sure say that having spent approximately 45 weeks in the field with you at CSETI trainings alone, not counting other things that we've done, I've never seen anything that wasn't just amazing and absolutely delightful and spiritual. And you know, we've been talking about the evil ET or alien paradigm here, but what we've seen in the field are just the elevated levels of good ET behavior. I mean, up to the extent of God consciousness beings that we've had a lot of contact with lately. It's just amazing. And the interview that we did that's archived on December 26th about the Orion transmissions really goes into that a lot if people haven't heard that.
Exactly, and I think that that's why people have to understand is that the actual interstellar civilizations that are here go from advanced and unified and peaceful all the way up to the level of supernal God consciousness civilizations that are they're material, and they're from the physical worlds, and they have spacecraft, but their technologies and their consciousness are operating from that finest celestial level of evolution that's astonishing. And that's the level that we are often interfacing with, and a support role around us will be with other ET civilizations that are on the evolutionary path to there. And by the way, there is a centralized global universal order to this. It isn't as if these civilizations are allowed to run around the cosmos like the Wild West. I mean, even humans have the United Nations, never mind it's very dysfunctional. So I think in conclusion, regarding what we want to share today is that people have an opportunity to choose how we respond to the cosmos and how we are in the cosmos. These visitors are here to help us and to understand us, and they're waiting. They're waiting for the human race to mature to a level of the first entry of what is considered mature world civilization, where we're living peacefully together. And we're there. We're getting very close. It doesn't seem that way sometimes, but I'm optimistic that that is exactly where we will end up. And these civilizations, which are highly organized and very conscious and rather enlightened, are standing ready to assist us as we make that transformation from the current period of division and confusion to a period of world peace and universal peace.
And I think in the early days, I'm talking the 1930s, 1940s, they didn't really know what they were dealing with. They also did not understand the technologies. And I think that they also didn't know why these visitors were here. For example, the big increase in all the sightings around the world happened at the time when we began to detonate nuclear weapons. This is not an accident. And I've been told by senior intelligence officials that essentially a big red flag went up over our planet saying we were in trouble. But not only are we in trouble, but we could be a threat to others, because you combine going into space, the early stages of space travel, and the use of hydrogen bombs and nuclear weapons, and a civilization on Earth that was still very violent, as you look around the Earth even today, of course. So this is something that any enlightened or even self-interested civilization observing the Earth, which I think we've been under observation for thousands of years, would be greatly concerned. But our military and government were completely shocked by this and didn't know what to do with it. I think that's the early, but later, I understand, of course, President Eisenhower wanted to make an announcement about this after he had a meeting near Edwards Air Force Base in 1954. But he was prevented from doing so by what he later called the military-industrial complex, because the interests for secrecy really fall into three broad areas. One is the inertia of the secrecy. Once you start something secret and you have made so many lies and frankly killed so many people and threatened so many people, and you've lied to Congress and you've lied to presidents, you know, how do you bring this out? They painted themselves into a black box. I've had discussions with senior levels at the Vatican to discuss this. And today, most mainstream religious groups would say, well, there's one supreme being in the universe, and there are many children of God, and we're all children of God. This is what Monsignor Balducci said when we interviewed him at the Vatican. But the Orthodox and fundamentalists would view this in a very disturbing way, because it would upset their worldview. And I think then the biggest became the technological and scientific end of this. Once we retrieved, back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, several of these extraterrestrial vehicles and began to study them, we combined that knowledge with knowledge we already had. Because remember, we had some people like T. Townsend Brown and the Biefeld-Brown effect who were studying anti-gravity, quite independent of this issue, back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But when their information got combined with studying these spacecraft, they figured out, this is how they're working. And they realized it's the end of oil. It's the end of the need for coal. It's the end of the combustion engine, the internal combustion engine. It's the end of transmission lines for electricity. because the energy that these spaceships are using, what people call UFOs, we don't call them, no one in the business calls them UFOs. They are not unidentified and they don't fly. And we'll get to this. But these objects are extracting energy from the fabric of space, okay, around, not outer space, but the fabric of space. And in fact, even the early Lockheed and Northrop experimental spaceships that we have built, and we're talking 1950s and 60s, were called flux liners because they were pulling energy from the quantum flux field, what's called the quantum flux field that's in the space in this room. And every cubic centimeter of space, for example, in this room has enough energy to run the Earth for a day. It's a huge amount of energy. And so once this was really figured out by the mid-50s, long time ago, 50 years ago, they knew that this would be the end of the oil cartels and the international financial petrodollar system, and a huge amount of the industrialists would then have to change their whole way of operating. Because think about it. What happens when every village in India or sub-Saharan Africa can have a device that looks like a generator and it's extracting energy from this quantum flux field? Suddenly, you have an economic growth all over the world. And this is a wonderful thing. It would be the end of poverty. But it would also be the end of the economic hegemony, where Europe and America, with 600 million people, dominate the whole global economy of 6 billion. So this is a huge geopolitical problem. And so the issue isn't about just money, it's about power. Who has the power? How the Earth is run? Who is running Earth? And then you have another issue, and that is there are people who view the world as they understand it. And in America we have a saying, if you wear rose-colored glasses, you see everything in the world is rose-colored. But if you're wearing glasses that are conflict-colored, colored with a sort of paranoid and militaristic view of the world, you're going to view these visitors as a threat, and you're going to respond to them as a threat, even though there's no evidence that they're a threat. I want to be very clear on this. There's no objective evidence that anyone has been harmed by these visitors, and there's certainly no evidence that they're a threat to us. There's a lot of evidence, however, that they're concerned about our threat to the peace and the order of space. Why? Because our technological capabilities and our weapons have surpassed our social and spiritual development, clearly. And we are at that stage in the evolution of a global civilization where our science and technology has gotten way out there, but our social and spiritual is lagging. And this is that danger zone. And Earth is in this danger zone now. And they know this. These visitors from other civilizations, other planets, know this. So, unfortunately, I think that they have had a great concern about our nuclear facilities. We know this. We have colonels and lieutenant colonels who are Strategic Air Command and the Atomic Energy Commission who have testified at disclosureproject.org that every single one of our nuclear weapon storage areas have been visited by these ET spacecraft because they were obviously concerned. And in the Soviet Union also, in Russia. We have spoken to people with the KGB and with their space command. And so it's clear that they have that concern, but that doesn't mean that they're hostile towards Earth. I think they're concerned about human hostility. And I think, however, this has gotten misinterpreted because here's the risk. In the vacuum of secrecy, when you have this vacuum of secrecy, it's very easy to begin to believe your own worldview, and there's no one telling you differently. This is the danger of a program being hermetically sealed and kept this secret, because they do not get the perspective and it's gotten out of control. And Eisenhower said when he left office in 1961, beware the military-industrial complex, because it can become a threat to our security, our way of life, and our democratic institutions. And he was a five-star general and a conservative Republican, but he was very concerned. And why? We have people who worked with him in the White House at that time who have told us, who are witnesses for our group, that he had been stabbed in the back by people who wanted to keep this secret and actually trumped or violated his presidential power and took these projects and hid them deeper and deeper and deeper. This is a very dangerous thing in a world where you're dealing with technologies this powerful. And this was, of course, President Clinton's frustration. President Clinton asked Webster Hubbell, who was third in command at Justice, to look into two things. And this is in his book, Webster Hubbell's book, Friends in High Places. Clinton wanted him to find out about what are these UFOs, and, you know, who's keeping it secret and why, and who killed Jack Kennedy, because Jack Kennedy was his hero. Well, we discovered there was a connection. But, and his CIA director, R. James Woolsey, was equally worried, because when I met personally with Woolsey here in the Washington area in December of 1993, he was very gravely shaken by the fact that there was a secret cabal or a whole level of government and corporate activity dealing with this issue that was lying to him as the CIA director and as also to the president. So of both religion and science that people don't want out. Because obviously, if you own a trillion-dollar oil field or a company that's assets are in that range, remember, this is not particularly good news for you. It's good news for humanity and for the earth and for the environment. But there's only a few hundred people and corporations who really control the world economy. And this information would change forever their grip on that power. Now, they would still have a lot of money, but it's not about money. You and I think of money, can I afford to put my son or daughter to college, or buy a home, or what have you. They're viewing it as power, the geopolitical control. So it's a power issue. And this would change geopolitics forever. It's because you're defanging their whole war plan. The next big war is not terrorism, it's interstellar. And if you expose that it's a hoax, it takes all the steam out of their plan. I said, yes, but if we don't, we're cooked, because there's no way you can have war that's interstellar and survive it. It'd be worse than mutual assured destruction, because the technologies are 1,000 times worse than a hydrogen bomb. So I said, look, we're going to have to figure out how to deal with this. And the only way I know how to do it is put the sunlight in there and let people know what the truth is. So a man came along. If we go to the next slide. And you probably have seen this. It's up on our website. When we first put it up, it had over 600,000 views. The next day, the intelligence community went in and said there were 6,000 views. By the way, if you believe the metrics on Google and YouTube, I have a bridge to sell you. It's all can be manipulated because it moves you down the search engines. So when this hit, within a couple of days, had 600,000 views. This man, William Pollock, his name is pronounced Powlick, was a man, very good man, who gave me an interview only to be released posthumously after he died. And not long, a few years ago, I got a letter from his wife, significant other, I guess, they weren't technically married, with a death certificate and a letter giving me permission, and he had passed away. And I have a lot of these. and I honor my word about keeping a confidence. So what happened is that he gave me this interview, and in it, he talks about the development of RF radio frequency chip implants back in the 70s and 80s. And when he was developed, it was totally an accidental thing that happened. He was with a company that developed it. He then got called into the CIA, and they started doing special programs for the CIA to develop it. And at a certain point, Siemens in Silicon Valley manufactured 2 billion of them, with a B, of these RF chips. And the way they work, I mean, they can be so miniaturized, you could eat something with it, it has a radio and it can transmit not only where you are, but the really advanced ones have a neurophone capability to control thought and behavior. Very sinister stuff. So you can actually do a lot of psychological warfare with these RF frequency chips. Now that was the early stages in the 70s and 80s. Now you figure, 40 years later, they're more and more and more and more sophisticated. And as I've watched the whole UFO subculture sort of get involved with this whole fascination with abductions and implants, I went, yeah, but EG&G is one of the plants is on the edge of the Area 51. They're the ones manufacturing the implants that you're taking out of these abduction victims. Absolutely. They're not coming from outer space. They don't need that. If you're interstellar, you're transdimensional. If you're transdimensional, you don't need an RF frequency plant chip to track anybody, because their technologies are way beyond that. I said, this is human, 100%. And you better wake up. And so Powlett gave us this interview, and it was one of a dozen data points that I began to accumulate. And then, not many years ago, I get a document, the next one, which is chilling. It's never been shown. It's from the Strategic Studies Institute, think tank, and it's dated 1995. And it was talking about all kinds of global security strategies. And, you can look at it yourself. Cult-programmed graduates, blah, 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 who will be expected to participate in contrived UFO abduction scenarios. Listen carefully. Oh, we need the next one up. Strategic Studies Institute. I can't see the screen. Is it up? All right. So I loathe reading to people but this I will. And number 2, create a global UFO cult, which will involve, this is what needs to be done in order to actuate this false flag operation, that will involve the abduction of citizens so as to foster an illusion that this Earth is facing an extraterrestrial invasion. UFO abductees of preference will have an experience in computer technologies, since that expertise will be required in future technocratic RMA scenarios. Use of experimental drugs, holographic projection capabilities, directed energy technologies, I'll get into that in a moment, induced auditory input. These are the neurophones I mentioned that Werner von Braun said the most dangerous thing is the neurophone, non-local things that can be done to make people think they're having an experience when they're not. Input experimental aircraft, well, that's just a euphemism for man-made UFOs, and special effects costuming and stagecraft, among other things, will be used to persuade the abductees of the reality of their circumstances. Official denials regarding these events will employ reverse psychology to ensure that all such denials are taken as official confirmation of an imminent and or ongoing extraterrestrial invasion. This is the next page. UFO abductees will be persuaded to worship their anticipated ET conquerors in cult-enforced religious fashion. UFO cult networks will be controlled by U.S. intelligence to limit infiltration and ensure that dissidents do not disrupt UFO long-term agendas. Uncontrollable dissidents will be assassinated, preferably by directed energy means. Dissociative satanic cult graduates will handle all such executions, i.e., when not actively lending logical and theatrical support to UFO abduction operations. Number 3, directed energy surveillance and weapons technology of all types and caps will be used for purposes of spreading fear and confusion in the population at large under deniable circumstances, for eliminating persons deemed adversarial to U.S. national security interests, and for spotting, assessing, and manipulating potential recruits to the RMA cause. Neurocybernetics and other psychotechnologies will be used to sow confusion and hypochondria in the population. The symptoms and effects produced by these and other directed energy technologies will parallel the effects produced by various microbes, viruses, and chemical imbalances, thus compelling a large segment of society to seek medical intervention, which in turn will be a basis for their being used for medical experimentation under voluntary circumstances. Psychiatrists and psychologists will play an important role in these experiments, particularly where denying the efficacy of cybernetics, psychotechnologies is concerned. Citizens who complain of hearing voices will be used as a basis for generously government-funded schizophrenic-related brain research, on and on and on. It goes on. Now, if you're not falling out of your chair yet, what I want to tell you is that all of that has come to pass and came to pass between the 1950s and the 1970s. A man that I worked with before his death had developed an electronic system in 1956 or 54, that would enable someone electronically to remote view anywhere, and could also affect, some of these have been called radionic psychotronic weapon systems, and they were developed decades ago. Now, how hard is it to deploy them? Not hard. They're not used every day. They're used enough to create a groundswell of conviction that there's an alien threat. So you take that capability, combine it with man-made UFOs, combine it with disinformation in general about the subject, and also certain chemicals, and you can launch an entire contagion of fear that's based on completely man-made false events. So this is the false flag event I wanted to warn you about. And people say, when is that going to happen? I said, it's happened already. It's already happened. The media, the film industry, any UFO conference you go to is going to be filled unwittingly, usually, not always unwittingly, but usually with information that is this kind of disinformation designed to create an us versus them dynamic of an alien threat. And the reason for it is that that is the only way to grow the military-industrial complex.